fatally wrong. This is the moment of ultimate triumph. And then in the next 5 minutes, you will be engulfed in a terrible storm of fire and steel from which there is no escape. You will watch as the most powerful naval force on the planet is utterly defeated. How did it come to this? How did it all go so wrong? To get the sheer shock of Midway for the Japanese, you have to understand to the mountain of confidence they were standing on. After the stunning success at Pearl Harbor, the Kidai, the first air fleet led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo went on a 6-month period of great success. They were the tip of the spear, the apex predator of the seas. The force was built around 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Suikaku. These weren't just ships, they were floating airfields crewed by the most experienced naval aviators on the planet. Many were veterans of the long war in China, hardened by years of real combat. Their skill was breathtaking. They could launch over 100 aircraft in less than 10 minutes, a level of efficiency their American counterparts were still struggling to match. After Pearl Harbor, their conquest was relentless. They supported invasions across the Pacific. They defeated Allied naval power at the Battle of the Java Sea. In April 1942, Nagumo led a 5-carrier force into the Indian Ocean, sending to the bottom the British carrier HMS Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers with almost casual ease. They proved that no corner of the new Japanese empire was beyond their reach. The flaw of victory disease. This unbroken chain of victories led to a dangerous condition that Japanese officers would later call victory disease. A deep-seated overconfidence started to influence the high command. They believed their pilots were just naturally better. Their fighting spirit was invincible, and their plans were flawless. American morale, they figured, had to be compromised. This arrogance wasn't just an attitude. It infected their strategic planning, blinding them to risks and causing them to wave off warnings that should have set off alarm bells. The men of the Kidobai were the best in the world, and they knew it. They had never lost, and they couldn't imagine they ever would. This supreme confidence followed them on the long voyage to a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific, an atoll named Midway. The man behind the Midway operation was the brilliant and often reckless commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto's worry, America's industrial power. Despite all the victories, Yamamoto was worried. He had studied in the United States and he understood its industrial power. In a way, many of his colleagues didn't. He knew Japan had a very short window to win the war before America's industrial engine roared to life and buried Japan under an avalanche of ships and planes. Pearl Harbor hadn't been a total success. The American aircraft carriers had escaped, as long as they were out there. The US Navy was a dagger, pointed at the heart of Japan's empire. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, when American bombers hit Tokyo itself, was a profound humiliation that proved Yamamoto right. The American carriers had to be neutralized. So Operation MI, Operation Mai, the decisive battle trap, was born. In Yamamoto's mind, this was it. The decisive battle of the war. The plan was a masterwork of complexity, a perfect trap to lure what was left of the US Pacific Fleet to its fall. The bait was the invasion of Midway Atoll, an American outpost, so important that Yamamoto was sure the US Navy would have to sail from Pearl Harbor to defend it. When they did, the full strength of the combined fleet would be waiting to defeat them. The plan was a classic example of Japanese naval doctrine, which loved intricate multi-part operations. A diversionary force would hit the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to try and draw American ships north. An invasion force would take Midway, and Vice Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu would lead the charge. First, neutralizing Midway's air defenses, then turning to defeat the American fleet. Trailing hundreds of miles behind them was the main body with Yamamoto himself on the super battleship Yamato, ready to complete the operation. But this complex, flaws, compromised codes and complexity plan was built on a foundation of bad assumptions and pure arrogance. First, it depended entirely on surprise. The Japanese were convinced their codes were secure and their intentions were a secret. They were fatally wrong. American Codebreakers in Hawaii had largely broken the main Japanese naval, Koji, JN-20 e 5. They knew the target was Midway, a fact they cleverly confirmed by having the base send a fake message about a water shortage, which Japanese intelligence promptly picked up. The Americans knew when the attack was coming and who was coming with it. As the Japanese fleet sailed in radio silence, thinking they were invisible, Admiral Chester Nimitz was already moving his own carriers to spring a counter-trap. Second, the plan was just too complicated. Everything depended on the perfect timing of separate fleets spread out over hundreds of miles of ocean, all without communicating. This meant they couldn't support each other. Nagumo's carriers, the most important part of the whole operation, were basically on their own. Intelligence failures. The unknown American carriers. Third, Japanese intelligence was a serious problem. A planned recon flight over Pearl Harbor was cancelled. A line of submarines meant to spot the American carriers leaving port was put in place. Too late. The American ships had already sailed past them. So the Japanese sailed towards Midway, believing the American carriers were still tied up in Pearl Harbor. They also dramatically underestimated American repair crews. They believed the carrier USS Yorktown had been struck, or at least crippled for months at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In reality, an incredible effort at Pearl Harbor got her patched up and ready to fight. The Americans were bringing 3 carriers to the party, not the 2 Japan expected. Maybe the most telling moment came during the pre-battle war games on the battleship Yamato. The story goes that in one simulation, the officer playing the American side launched a surprise attack that was ruled to have rendered inoperable 2 of Nagumo's carriers. The chief umpire, Rear Admiral Ugaki Mate, simply overruled the call. He put the carriers back on the board, saying such an outcome was unlikely. The flaws in the plan were right there on paper, but they were dismissed by victory disease. The trap was set. But the Japanese didn't realize they were the ones about to walk into it at 4:30 inches the morning on June 4th, 1942. The decks of the Kidai roared to life. In a stunning display of efficiency, 108 aircraft were launched in just 7 minutes to strike Midway Island. Their mission compromised the island's air power to clear the way for the invasion. As they flew off, Admiral Nagumo held half his planes in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready for their real mission, neutralizing any American ships that showed up. Soon, Nagumo's force came under countermeasure. A series of desperate, almost suicidal strikes by Midway-based American planes threw themselves at the Japanese fleet. They were brave, but they were no match for the veteran Japanese fighter pilots. The Zeros tore the American planes apart, and any that got through were met by a solid wall of anti-aircraft fire. Not a single bomb or torpedo hit Nagumo's ships. From the bridge of the flagship, Akagi, it looked like another easy victory. Then at 7 a.m., a message. The fateful order, rearming for a second strike, arrived that started to unravel everything. It was from the leader of the Midway strike, Lieutenant Tomaga. His report was blunt. There is a need for a second attack. The first strike hadn't been enough to knock out the island. This message put Admiral Nagumo in an impossible position. Yamamoto's orders were clear. Keep the reserve, planes armed and ready for enemy ships, but there was no sign of an American fleet. His own scout planes were reporting nothing but empty ocean. The attacks from Midway, while useless, were an annoying problem to Nagumo. A cautious commander, the logical move was to deal with the known threat, the island, before worrying about a hypothetical one. At 7:15, he gave the fateful order. Rearm the reserve. Aircraft, the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs were to be swapped out for land attack bombs. This was no small job. On all four carriers, the hangar decks became scenes of controlled chaos as crews wrestled the heavy torpedoes off the planes and wheeled up high explosive bombs. It was a laborious process that could take over an hour. The decks were now a dangerous jumble of armed planes, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. Carrier spotted. The real target is found. Lines. Just as this was happening, the situation changed again. At 7:28, the scout plane from the cruiser Tone, which had launched 30 minutes late, a crucial delay, sent a shocking message. It had spotted 10 enemy ships. A stunned silence fell over the Akagi's bridge. Nagumo immediately shot back a new order. Prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those attack planes, which have not as yet been changed to bombs. This only made the chaos on the hangar decks worse. Then at 8:20 came the nail in the coffin. The scout pilot radioed again. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. The hunters had just become the hunted. The real target was here. On the bridge of the Promise, Hiryu, the aggressive rear admiral Tamun, Yamguchi urged Nagumo to launch attack force immediately. He argued for sending whatever they had right now to hit the Americans before they could hit them. Nagumo hesitated. His by-the-book training took over. Japanese doctrine demanded a fully coordinated strike with fighter escort. To launch now would be to send his bombers in piecemeal, without enough protection. On top of that, his first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. His carriers couldn't launch and recover planes at the same time. Nagumo had an impossible choice. Launch a weak, hasty attack now or recover his planes, organize a powerful, coordinated strike and risk getting hit first. He chose to wait. It was the logical doctrinal decision. It was also a fatal one, as the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to recover their planes. Their flight decks were blocked. And just the sacrifice of the torpedo bombers. Then, a new wave of American countermeasures began. 3 squadrons of torpedo bombers from the American carriers found the Kidai, flying low and slow in their obsolete TBD Devastator. planes, they were severely hit. Of 41 planes, only a handful made it back. They didn't score a single hit, but their sacrifice wasn't in vain. They dragged the Japanese fighter patrol down to sea level, pulling them completely out of position. By 10:20, as the last torpedo attack faded, the decks of the Kido were finally being readied for the counterstrike. On the bridge of the Akagi, there was a sense of relief. They'd weathered the storm. Now it was their turn. The time was 10:20 a.m. On the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, pilots sat in their cockpits, engines sputtering to life. The ships began turning into the wind, preparing to launch their action on the American fleet. They were at their most vulnerable moment, and they had absolutely no idea. The relentless torpedo attacks had pulled their protective fighter screen down to the waves, leaving the skies above them wide open. Without radar, they were flying blind. At 10:24, a deck officer raised the 10:24 a.m. The American divers arrive. White flag to signal the launch. As the first Zero fighter roared down the flight deck, a lookout scream cut through the air. Hell divers. Out of the sun from nearly 20,000 feet, 36 American SPD Dauntless dive bombers appeared as if from nowhere. They were from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, arriving completely undetected at the perfect moment. For the men on the decks below, there was no warning, only the terrifying scream of diving planes. The devastation of the flagship, Akagi, and fleet. Attack was swift and brutally precise. The first bomb slammed into the carrier, Kaga. One hit the bridge, resulting in the loss of the captain and his command and staff. But the fatal blow was a 1,000 pounds bomb that crashed through to the upper hangar, which was packed with fully fueled and armed planes. A chain reaction of secondary detonations erupted, turning the carrier into a raging blaze. At the same time, Soryu was hit by bombers from the Yorktown. 3 bombs struck her. Just like on Kaga, one penetrated to the hangar deck, igniting the waiting planes and fuel. Within 20 minutes, the ship was a lost cause. The flagship Akagi took only 1 direct hit, but it was enough. The bomb plunged into the upper hangar, right in the middle of the armed torpedo bombers, being readied for the strike. The effect was devastating. The tightly packed hangar became a giant fireball. Admiral Nagumo stood in a state of shock, staring at the flames consuming his fleet. His staff practically had to drag him off the burning flagship in the space of just 5 minutes. The heart of the Kido Butai was ripped out. 3 of Japan's finest carriers were burning wrecks. The Japanese obsession with offensive power meant their carriers had poor damage control, and the practice of storing fueled and armed planes in enclosed hangars proved to be a fatal design flaw. Hiryu's counterattack and final defiance. But the fight wasn't over. Not quite. One carrier, the Hiryu, commanded by the fiery Rear Admiral Taemon Yamguchi, had been further north and escaped the attack. With the other 3 carriers burning, Yamaguchi immediately ordered a counterattack. His planes found the American carrier USS Yorktown and hit her with 3 bombs. A second strike from Hiryu found the damaged Yorktown again and put 2 torpedoes into her. The Japanese pilots returned, believing they'd neutralized 2 separate American dot carriers. It was a final defiant act. American scout planes found the lone Japanese carrier. Late that afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found the Hiryu and slammed 4 bombs into her. By the next morning, the last of the staggering toll, loss of ships and elite aviators, Nagumo's carriers was gone. The sword of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been damaged. As the sun set on June 4th, the Pacific was lit by the funeral PS of the Hidobutai. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, plus the heavy cruiser Mikuma, were all going under to the bottom of the sea. But losing the ships was secondary to losing the men. The final toll was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese officers, sailors, and technicians were lost. Among them were Japan's most experienced combat, hardened naval aviators, and maintenance crews. These weren't just pilots. They were the irreplaceable core of Japan's naval air power, an asset their training, programs, and industrial base could never replace. The United States, on the other hand, was just getting started. The cover-up and culture of denial. Defeat was so total, so shocking that the Japanese government went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up. The public was told Midway was a great victory. The survivors were brought back to Japan in secret, quarantined, and forbidden from speaking about what really happened, even to their own families. To hide the truth, the lost ships were even kept on the Navy's official roster for a time, their status shrouded in bureaucratic silence. This culture of denial meant the Imperial Japanese Navy never had an honest reckoning with its failures, the doctrinal flaws, the terrible intelligence, and the rigid planning were never properly addressed, because admitting to them meant admitting the scale of the disaster. Midway was the undisputed turning point of the war, undisputed turning point of the Pacific War. In one day, Japan's offensive power was compromised, and the strategic initiative was handed to the United States. Never again would the Japanese Navy launch a major offensive. The defeat set the stage for the difficult War of Attrition in the Solomon Islands, which began with the American landing on Guadalcanal just 2 months later. A war Japan could not win. The story of the timeless lesson of pride and indecision. Midway from the Japanese side is a harsh lesson. It's a story of how a force at the absolute zenith of its power, blinded by success and convinced of its own invincibility, could author its own downfall, an overly complex plan, a fatal underestimation of the enemy, and a moment of indecision at the worst possible time doomed the finest carrier fleet in the world. The 5 minutes of tension over the Kidai on June 4th didn't just cause the loss of 4 ships. They compromised the ambitions of an empire. The Battle of Midway is a timeless lesson in how pride, bad assumptions, and the sheer fog of war can bring even the mightiest to ruin. It's not just a story of ships and planes, but of the human decisions and fatal flaws that sealed an empire's fate. If you found this, look at the other side of the story, insightful, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. We explore the lesser-known sides of history's biggest turning points every week. Let us know in the comments what you think. Was the single most critical factor in Japan's defeat? Was it a flawed plan, Nagumo's hesitation, or just bad luck? We'd love to hear your thoughts.